Hi, I'm Donald Robertson, and I'm here in Austria at the museum in Carnuntum, which is where Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations. I'm here to talk about how to think like a Roman emperor, the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. And we are looking at chapter 6, the inner citadel and the war of many nations, which is about coping with worry and anxiety. So I want to cut to the chase and talk about some of the key practical techniques. Now, I as a therapist, as a cognitive therapist, I specialize in anxiety management. So this is a huge subject for me. I could talk about it for days and days. So I'm going to try and kind of pare it right down to a couple of very simple things that I think everybody should know. So first of all, we usually distinguish between different types of anxiety because different types of anxiety respond to different types of treatment strategy. So I'm particularly going to talk about a very common form of anxiety that psychologists just refer to as worrying. And by worrying, they mean not so much a feeling as a particular style of thinking. It's called perseverative of thinking, so thinking that goes on and on and on, round in circles. And worried thinking usually is described as catastrophic or what-if thinking, where people say things like, what if I lose my job? What if I make a fool of myself? What if I get sick? What if I lose all of my money? And so they pose these questions about feared catastrophes. And that's usually accompanied by a sense of one's inability to cope. So what if I lose my job? I won't be able to handle it. So there's a severe appraisal of threat and a poor appraisal of coping. And those two things combined tend to make people feel pretty anxious. And there's a lot of research that's been conducted over the past 20 years or so by a number of prominent psychologists into the nature, the psychology of worrying in particular. But actually we know of a very simple behaviour therapy or cognitive behavioural strategy that's pretty effective for dealing with worry, and it forms part of a number of different cognitive behavioural therapy treatment protocols for people that suffer from very severe pathological worry. There's a diagnosis called Generalized Anxiety Disorder, or GAD, or GAD, which is sometimes described as the worrying disorder. So worry occurs in a bunch of different disorders, but GAD in particular is characterised by very severe pathological worrying. And so we know that even people with very severe worry, people that suffer from generalized anxiety disorder, can benefit from this very simple strategy. In the 1980s, a psychologist in America called Tom Borkovec carried out an experiment with college students where he asked them to notice when they were beginning to worry about things and then engage in a strategy that's usually described as worry postponement, or sometimes behavioural psychologists call it the stimulus control method. And what the students were taught to do is, first of all, they have to catch themselves worrying. And that's important because usually people don't notice when they're worrying, or they don't notice for a while. So the earlier you catch the process happening, the better. This is similar to what we've already said about some other problems like dealing with habits and desires, if you've listened to that video. But learning to nip worry in the bud is key. So catching early warning signs of worry is absolutely crucial. And that takes a little bit of effort. It takes a little bit of thought. It's a form of self-awareness training. And the best advice I can give people is, in my clinical practice, I usually found that people are, when they worry, they get lost in thought. So they're typically unaware of what they're doing with their body. And you may be fidgeting with your hands when you're worrying. You may stare into the middle distance. But typically, people tense their shoulders or they frown when they're engaging in worry, or even if it's only slightly that they're doing these things. But they usually don't notice that their facial expression or their body posture has changed. Becoming much more aware of the fact that's happening is antagonistic to worry. It will tend to snap you out of worry. It interferes with the process. So becoming much more aware of the way you're using your body is important. To worry about things, we have to kind of get lost in the future and lost in thought. If you notice what you're doing with your face, it prevents you from being able to get lost in thought in the same way. I won't go further into it. There's a lot more we could say about the psychology of that, but noticing what you're physically doing in the here and now tends to interfere with the whole process of worrying. So that's helpful if you want to break out of that cycle. So noticing worry at a very early stage is a good thing. And what those students were asked to do is just very simply write down in 1 or 2 words what they were worrying about. So they might say, losing my job or something like that, and write it down on a piece of paper and then put it away in their pocket. Now, the key thing here with postponement is that you're trying to find a middle path between dwelling on something too much and trying to avoid thinking about it, because both of those strategies are unhelpful. So what you're doing is something in between. You're saying, I can think about this, but I'm going to think about it later. So I'm not completely avoiding it, I'm postponing thinking about it till a more appropriate time. And actually that's a completely natural thing to do. We have to be able to do that. Because if you're engaged in any task in normal daily life that requires concentration, you're probably going to have to defer certain other intrusive trains of thought. And the most common example of that, not one that requires concentration, but a situation where you'd normally defer thought is going to sleep at night. People who have problems with severe worrying often have incipient insomnia, which means they have problems falling asleep at night because they worry about stuff and they find it hard to set their worries aside. But normally if you're lying in bed late at night and you think, oh damn, I've forgotten to post a letter or I haven't done my tax returns, you normally think, I'll deal with that tomorrow morning because right now I'm trying to get to sleep. So it's natural in that situation to defer thinking about something until a more appropriate time. I mean, it would be the same if you were engaged in a conversation or playing a game of chess or something. You might have a thought that pops into your mind about something that's threatening or worrying, and it would be normal to say, I can't deal with that right now, I'm going to have to think about it later. That's different from completely avoiding it. You're saying, just not right now, I'll come back to it later. So you write it down on a piece of paper, stick it in your pocket and defer. And it helps if you defer it or postpone it until a specific time and place. So we call that having a worry time. So you might say 7 o'clock in the evening or whenever is appropriate. When I sit in a particular chair, that's when I'm going to come back to whatever I'd written down, one or more items that I'd written down to think about later that I was going to worry about. Now, the first thing to say is that often when people come to their worry time and they take out the piece of paper, if they have anything on it, the first question to ask is, does this still matter? Because at least half the time, people will say, it doesn't seem important anymore. In that case, just let it go. Like, you don't feel it's important, then you don't have to think about it anymore. And the key here is often we feel anxious at the time when worries pop into our mind, and our anxiety will distort our thinking anyway. It makes us less rational, it makes it harder for us to problem solve. And when that anxiety naturally abates over time, we're relaxed, we're in a different environment, we come back to it, it might not seem important anymore, or it might seem like a trivial or an easily solved problem, not something that we have to actually worry about. So if it doesn't seem like it's worth worrying about anymore, or the answer seems obvious, then you don't need to dwell on it. However, if it does still seem like a problem, then there are a number of different things that you can do during your worry time. And there are really a whole bunch of different strategies that you can employ at that point. But some psychologists, some therapists, such as Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, think that one of the most important things to do is a technique that we call imaginal exposure in therapy. And that's a very simple emotional technique designed to use a natural, well-established, robust psychological mechanism called emotional habituation in order to take the edge off our anxiety. And emotional habituation is just the fact that when you think about something that's anxiety provoking, contrary to what many people assume, virtually in every case, anxiety normally wears off over time if you're patient enough. And that might take 5, 10, 15 minutes. It usually requires quite a lot more patience than people normally have. But the key thing in imaginal exposure, the thing that differentiates it from worry, is that when people worry, it's mainly a verbal process. It usually involves posing questions, and we tend to skip around a lot as if from one thought to another. Whereas for emotional habituation to happen, for anxiety to wear off, it usually has to be a visual form of thinking. It normally has to be more static, like focusing on a particular part of the problem, and we need to sit with it for longer than normal usually. So it's a different style of thinking from worrying. It's more visual and more patient. So if you can sit with a visual image of the thing that you're worrying about for long enough until your anxiety has reduced to about half its original level or below, you'll normally find that by doing that maybe just once, or often you might have to do it several times, maybe over several days, eventually your anxiety will wear off in a lasting or a permanent way. And we call that emotional habituation. We call the technique imaginal exposure. It's one of the most robustly established techniques in the entire field of psychotherapy research. The Stoics had this idea. They knew that anxiety wears off over time, and that's the reason that they employ a technique that they call premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of bad things, the premeditation of adversity. So they tell themselves to regularly picture setbacks or misfortunes as if they're happening now, because they knew that by doing that, the anxiety, if we're patient enough, will naturally wear off. So those are a couple of techniques, worry postponement and imaginal exposure, that are really fundamental to modern evidence-based cognitive behavioural therapy for dealing with this particular type of anxiety. And we can find similar techniques in Marcus Aurelius and in the writings of Epictetus and other Stoics. So let me know how you get on with those techniques. I hope you find them helpful. And again, that's just a little taste of the more in-depth discussion that you'll find in that chapter in the book, The Inner Citadel and the War of Many Nations.